Okay, this week we have a very special guest, a man that I consider it a great pleasure and honor to be a friend with. His name's Brad Garton. He is the head of the CMC Computer Music Center at Columbia University. He's also a really interesting developer of stuff. And by stuff, I mean interesting software tools and software creations for the computer and computer music. Hi, Brad. How are you?
Hi, Darwin. And the feeling of friendship and honor is mutual.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. As is typical for the podcast, especially when we're introducing people for the first time, I like to ask them to give us a little bit of their background. Now, I know you have a really interesting background, particularly because you were doing computer music when computer music wasn't easy. And so if you could give us just a little bit of your history, your personal history, and maybe some of the work that you've done, that would be a great starting point.
Okay, well, yeah, interesting maybe is quite a word. I have a number of undergraduate advisees where I teach at Columbia, and they come to me with their life all planned out, and I tell them, don't ever underestimate the fundamental randomness of life, because I actually didn't start really in music, even though I had loved music and had done it since, I can remember. My undergraduate degree is in pharmacy, and essentially I'm a failed pharmacist.
Well, that puts you in a good spot.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. But basically what happened was I went to Purdue University because, of course, you had to get a real education and get a real job, and music wasn't one of those jobs in the Midwest. And the really good thing that happened there, well, two good things. First of all, in Lafayette, there wasn't a whole lot back then in the way of entertainment, so we had to kind of make our own. So I got involved with a lot of bands. Actually, I've been involved in bands since junior high school. But I also met a friend, Rick Thomas, who is now the chairman of the theater program there at Purdue. And we started a recording studio, and that was kind of the downfall of my academic career back then, even though I did finally manage to graduate. But I began to spend much more time in the studio than I did, doing things like going to classes and such, and just fell in love with, technology and using it to craft sound. Of course, back then it was all analog. We had some Moog, micro Moog synthesizers. I had an old Orchestron, all the fun stuff.
Right.
And so eventually I had to get a job, and through my job I met the woman that became my wife, and she was a Jersey girl, so I decided to move out to New Jersey. This is early 1980s. And I thought, I've been hearing in the recording studio business, about this new stuff called digital sound. And I thought, maybe I better learn about this digital sound. And I looked at New Jersey and I said, where are they doing stuff in digital sound? And, well, there's Princeton right in the middle of New Jersey where we were going to be living. And I thought, what the heck, I'll apply there and learn about digital sound. I didn't realize it was actually hard to get into the program.
Right.
And to this day, I can't understand why they accepted me as one of their incoming grad students. I must have made up something to impress them. But we started out, I came on board about 1982, 83, and Paul Lansky just retired last month. Well, he's one of the big mentors in my life. He's one of the luminaries in computer music. And he sat me down when I arrived and said, well, here's the menu. I'll take you down to the computer center, because that's where we used to have to work, where they had a big IBM 3081 mainframe. And I think it had maybe, 10K of RAM. Whoa. And that was basically the machine that we used to make audio. And the process of making audio back then was that you had to type up programs. And it's funny because it shows how close we were to the really ancient days. The lines of code that we typed, we called cards. Each line was a card, because, actually when I learned to compute at Purdue, we actually had to type out punch cards and submit the deck. And the process was that you would then submit this job on the mainframe, wait for about 3 hours, and then you could go and check out a tape that you could then take across campus to another lab, the Godfrey Winham Studio, as it was called back then, and put the tape on a mini computer. It was a Data General. I don't think it was a Nova. No, it was a PDP-11. PDP-1134, sorry.
Right, okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I know you don't want to get into the old guy stuff.
No, I mean, old guy radio is pretty fun sometimes, especially when you're talking about some of this creaky old hardware.
Oh man, it was wild. But anyhow, we check out the tape, this digital tape, put it on this other computer, and then initiate conversion by typing in some hex addresses. And after 3 hours, you discovered you'd mistyped one of your cards, and your masterpiece went click, and that was about it.
Right.
So it was quite a time, But the really cool thing that happened while I was there at Princeton was second year of my graduate program, we negotiated, or Paul Lansky negotiated an agreement where we moved off the mainframe and moved on to what were called mini computers at the time. These are called microvax 2s that we got. And as part of that, we moved to a new operating system, which was relatively unknown back then, called Unix. And I was part of the team. It was me, Paul Lansky, Andy Milburn, Dave Medull, Lars Graf, a few others, that actually did the porting of the original computer music language Mix, which came from Fortran 4VF, Music 4VF, from Fortran to C. And that was just an incredible experience to be there, to be able to help build a computer music language and to be involved in that kind of excitement of creating something new. And that kind of was how I rounded out my graduate career at Princeton. Ultimately, how much do you want to know? Do you want to know about like dissertation stuff and all that nonsense?
Well, if you think it's relevant, I think it's just really interesting to kind of hear this kind of movement, because I think an awful lot of people don't recognize sort of like the grueling nature of making the transitions. I mean, now it's sort of like we wait around rather impatiently for people to create software for us so that we can make music. And the idea of like, you can't really make music until you get done with your Fortran to C conversion is actually a pretty hilarious and completely unthinkable mode of operation. But also pretty wonderful, because the fact is you probably knew what that program, you knew what the Mix program did at such a fundamental level. How did that affect the way that you worked with that software?
Actually, that's a really good question, and it's kind of a really relevant point that I try and kind of communicate to our students. What I did when I came to Columbia. It's funny you mentioned how you had to do all this stuff before you could even make sound. The first thing I had to do is write a piece of code called a device driver for Sun workstations.
Jesus.
Yeah, it's not trivial.
No.
So that's how I spent the summer before my classes, just crashing computers all day long. But I mean, and that level of code, come on, you don't really need to know that. But knowing the languages, knowing the technology, knowing the capabilities, to me, this is the key to unlocking possibilities that, technology provides. Imagining ways of being creative, doing your art that you won't necessarily think of, just kind of like taking stuff from off the shelf and adopting paradigms that kind of currently exist. I'm not a big fan of concerts, for example. The idea of a computer music concert, although now it's much better because of all the interactivity that's going on, but back in the olden days, when you go to a computer music concert and basically they would play tapes, right, that was just weird to me,
Yeah, well, the tape recorder would occupy the center of the stage. Very, very strange.
Yeah, and it's funny because at Columbia and at Princeton, we actually tried to make almost a fetish of this, and we would do things like set up the concert stage like a living room and put the tape recorder right there and say, "Invite you into our living room," and try to kind of deconstruct that a little bit. So yeah, I think knowledge of the technology can really do a lot towards giving you, like I said, opportunities, creative opportunities that you might not discover otherwise. And to me, that's also the big excitement of this era. We've got these incredible machines that can pretty much do what we tell them to do. And it's been marvelous to see how that has taken root in terms of people developing new interface technologies, new ways of interacting with sound, new ways of sculpting and creating sound. I'm fortunate because I have a front row seat at that, through all our students, through our program. That's a real big gift for me.
Sure. Well, let's go back to kind of how you came up through the ranks, because I have heard rumors that you getting to your position at Columbia was actually kind of a crazy ride. So tell us a little bit about how you went from being Paul Lansky's sea monkey to your current position at Columbia.
Well, this is another one of those opportunities that technology can provide.
Right.
Basically, what happened, I'll just give you the naked story, is Russ Pinkston he was the director of the Computer Music Center at Columbia. Russ is a really great friend. He's teaching now at University of Texas, Austin, which actually factors into this story. Like I said, I had to write the device driver for these Sun workstations. He'd ordered a couple of really high-end, back then, Sun 3280S workstations. Whoa, cool. Right. He promptly got an offer, tenured offer from University of Texas, Austin, that Columbia could not match. And so he made his choice, a smart one, and moved to UT Austin, where he now teaches and has been on faculty for years. Sure. And so they're coming up. I think this is happening. Offers go out in academia at the end of April. And Russ had accepted the offer. It's May. They got these new computers arriving in 2 weeks, and they need to teach classes the following fall. So they called up Paul Lansky, Mario Davidovsky, said, "Do you have somebody who can teach? All these stuff, these computers?" And Paul suggested a couple of people. I was closest to getting my dissertation done, and I knew the tech. So I don't think they listened to any of my music, to be honest. I just went up and talked with Mario and George Edwards, and they said, "Oh, all right, you're hired." So I just got in and just started working with the machines and running the place the way that I thought might be kind of fun to run, which is also steeped by my experience at Princeton. Not just Paul Lansky, but Jim Randall, who sadly just passed away about a week and a half ago. Oh my. They had a really, really great take on what it means to build a community, what it means to do music together. And a lot of people go, "Oh, computers," especially back then, "oh, they're so cold and sterile." I found exactly the opposite, that because of this shared enterprise, a group of us would come together and we'd really kind of, become great friends, actually. I mean, to this day, all these people that, started in the early days and up through now, students and whatever at Columbia, we're all kind of hanging out. But anyhow, so I had to go up and, do all this stuff, and I started having fun. And I kind of realized early on something that proved to be a really great realization. I figured that I had no chance of getting tenure at Columbia. Because, my music, it's fairly tonal, pretty straightforward, kind of weird in a very non-academic way, and I wasn't sort of following what Mario would call the grand tradition of music, where you're overly concerned with pitch relations in a very strange way, and it's kind of like a really refined version of high modernism in music. Right. That wasn't me at all. I was just saying, "Whoa, listen to what this can do. Whoa, I'll try to expand it. Whoa, that's cool." So it wasn't. People underestimate it. I always say it wasn't intellectual in a sense, but actually it really was. But intellectual in a very different sense than the standard sort of line. So kind of go along. And in fact, my tenure bid at Columbia started with the department chairman calling me into his office and saying, "Well, Brad, the department figures you have no chance in hell, so we're not even going to bother to nominate you." So that was how I started my tenure bid. Things had changed. Several faculty had left Columbia. They'd gotten better offers elsewhere, which proved to be removal of particular roadblocks for me. And my hero, Fred Laerdal, who's one of my colleagues at Columbia, said, "We have to keep this person. This guy's really... he knows a lot about computers and computer music." And fortunately, again, technology came to my rescue. Right. And the other thing that was set in place that I didn't appreciate until afterwards is that the higher administration at Columbia really wanted me to stay. because back then, this is mid-1990s, there was a big push to put technology, especially in art and humanities departments.
Right.
And I was the guy who could do that in the music department. So once Fred began to kind of make some serious noise, and Fred is good at that, the department changed its mind, and then tenure happened.
Wow.
So here I am.
Well, it's kind of interesting that technology sort of paved the way for that. To what extent did that have to do with funding? Because back in the day, one of the reasons that technology kind of got wedged into almost any area of study was because there was funding either by the computer companies themselves or by the government, who wanted to try and find some way to push technology because that was something that was deemed sellable.
Yeah, that was I'm sure that was part of the administration's endorsement of me too.
Right.
I discovered that I was actually very good at fundraising back then. And I had a really great team. I mean, Thanasis Rakakis is working for us now. He's now, I think, Executive Vice Provost for Technology at Carnegie Mellon. I can't remember the job title. But he and I put together a lot of stuff. Terry Pender was working with us. Terry's still with us. And we hired Dan Truman to work for us for a while. Wow. This is before he got his job at Princeton. And Douglas Repetto came on board. So we had a really wonderful team of people. And I
mean, that's like the luminaries of the context now. That's really an amazing group of people.
Oh yeah. It's funny. I'll take a little side road here. It was with that group, and especially some of the students that we had back then, leading into, I listened to your podcast with Jeff Snyder.
Yeah.
Oh man, that made me feel pretty good.
All right. He thinks you guys are made of gold.
Yeah. Well, and some of that it's funny. I don't really do that hardware physical computing stuff. I'm a software guy.
Right.
And with these people like Doug and Dan and Jeff and Sam Pluta and Daniel Glazia, I mean, all these guys, they were kind of there, and they were really interested in this stuff. And I learned the virtue of stepping aside and letting them do their work.
Right.
And that was a really great lesson to have. Some people, when confronted with something they don't do or understand, will say, "No, we're doing it this way."
Right.
That's not me. I learned early on. No, that's the bad thing to do.
Right.
But anyhow, like I said, we became, the fact that we had such a huge staff, for example, and I was able to secure enough money that basically the Computer Music Center has been existing on soft money up until about a year ago. And that's when we put in place, we have a new master's program in sound arts that Douglas Repetto is the director of. Right. And that was an occasion for us to rethink our budget and redo things. And now the Computer Music Center does not require external fundraising.
Wow.
But again, back in the 1990s, that was a big part of it. And like I said, I was very successful at doing that. I also learned, in fact, we all learned at the CMC, to be careful about fundraising, because when you write grants to do things, you then have to do the things that you said to do.
It comes with expectations.
Yeah, right. And, this is interesting. I was lucky because a lot of the money I raised, we had a guy working in the University Development Office who set it up as gift accounts rather than grants. Okay. And that gave us a lot more freedom. One of the fundamental differences at Columbia and a number of places I visited is that graduate students and fellows in arts and humanities don't realize sometimes how good they have it. All of my colleagues in the engineering, the hard sciences, even though they get huge grants and they have access to NSF monies, or hopefully they still will, they have to provide all the support for their graduate students and their labs through that fundraising. We have blanket fellowships and, like I said, a good budget at the CMC where I don't have to do any fundraising ever again if I don't want to. And that's incredible. We can continue to do what we like to do. Then we can say, well, let's see if we can get some money to do this thing that we would like to try to do.
Right.
That's a really great position to be in. So, boy, this is pretty boring, Darwin.
You know what though? It's not. I don't know. It's interesting because with these podcasts, one of the things that I found is that every person is interacting with the world of art and music and technology in a completely different way than everyone else. And so while it's probably boring to you because you've lived this for the last 20 years, nobody else really gets to see this stuff in action. You know, we all understand, oh, all right, there's this music school, and I see occasionally pictures of this really big synthesizer thing in Brad's office. But how does that even exist? And you know, I think that there's an awful lot of curiosity about how these programs work because, you know, in fact, your program is responsible for producing a lot of really interesting people coming out of it and people who do atypical things. And I think this goes back to something you said earlier about your own music, which is that your music, I would say, I have this kind of like joke about how in order to listen to most academic music, you have to have a certain amount of hair coming out of your ears, you know. And if you go to even if you go to like AES, you can walk around and say, oh, okay, there's a person that comes out of the academic music world. They have big bushes coming out of their ears, right? What's interesting to me is that your music, when I listen to your music, you've shared with me some really interesting stuff, which is how algorithmically you've done sort of like Irish fiddle tunes, or kind of algorithmically and with some sonic tweaks, all of a sudden you're doing prog rock tunes, which a lot of people wouldn't think of being part of the academic world. But I think that's because, well, I'm not sure why that is. But one of the things that I would say is that I came up through sort of the academic thing. I too, in my early days, I actually got to work on a PDP-11, helping hand wire audio boards to try and make an ear training system for it. And I remember back then having a computer generate a 12-bar blues was so amazing that it didn't matter that it was a 12-bar blues, right? And so there was a sense of wonder that came along with that was, unless you really felt the need to do the high modernist thing, there was just a joyfulness in just being able to make the damn thing do something, right?
Yeah. You know, it's funny. That gets back to that, you know, when I said it's intellectual in a different sort of way.
Right.
You know, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You know, that there's this engagement that you can have by exploring the capabilities of these systems, you know, and, you know, doing some pretty serious thinking about what does it mean to have a device that I can tell it what to do, and it may not do what I tell it, but it'll do something bizarre.
Right. Well,
you know?
but and there was also another thing which I think, you know, because of your background, you came up with and probably were very aware of as well, especially since you're not a concert head. For me, one of the things that really entranced me about computers and music was the fact that I could do and test drive orchestration without having to formulate a gathering of people. You know, so it used to be that if I wanted to try doing a jazz chart, I would at the least have to find 5 people that would, you know, stop huffing a bong long enough to, you know, to play to try out a track, right?
Right.
Or in an even worse case, if I wanted to do something that was orchestral in nature, it was going to be nigh impossible for me to do it. And so all of a sudden the computer offered the opportunity to try things out without the embarrassment of saying, okay, I got you all together and what I just did stinks. You know,
Yeah.
It gave me the chance to be an editor, which sadly maybe I've overdone a bit.
I don't think so, Darwin.
Well, I don't know. I don't have very much work out there because the second that I actually seal something up, I listen to it and I'm like, well, I can do better than that, right?
But this is the case where, step back a bit and you see that opportunity, because I would say that, by focusing on what you might think of as the end product, actually getting stuff, quote, out there or something like that, you're kind of missing the point of what it is you're doing. And for me, music is all, like I said, that word, academic word, engagement. It's all about this engagement you have with something, and to me, the most profoundly musical I've seen you be is when you're sitting back fooling around with your analog monstrosity,
right.
and plugging in things and everything like that, and saying, oh, well, that's not really it. I'm going to do something then, and then, present it to an audience. That's kind of missing what the real musical action is,
right.
Because the musical action is that editing process that you do. And that kind of engagement.
Yeah, I just wish, we both maybe suffer a little bit from the Midwestern thing, which is I wish I had the ability to just say, hey, I just laid a turd and it seems kind of golden, so let's rock it out there, right?
There you go. Yeah, and you know what? I need to kind of temper what I'm saying a little bit by, you're talking about people with different backgrounds and different ways of making their way in the world. And I look at you and how you've managed to negotiate these things and rise to a position of, some authority in the world. I feel like I won the lottery, Few people I recognize have the kind of job that I do where I have the freedom and the support to do what I do. And to me, that signals, well, you have this sort of station where you've arrived. What can you do from there? You know?
Yeah, that's actually a really great point. And kind of to further that point and to kind of tie it in with this idea of releasing material, I'm curious what you think about code, the development of software and the creation of code as actually being an artistic release. And I put that in quote marks, but not very big quote marks. Yeah. Because to a certain extent, I feel like whether it's the code that I've cut for a variety of people that I've worked with, or documentation that I've done, or examples or tutorials or workshops, I feel that those things, because of their effect on the world, represent the best artistic releases that I've done in sort of like practical terms.
Yeah.
Now, do I always consider it that way? I don't know. But again, I feel lucky to be in the position I'm in. And I, too, feel like I've won the lottery. And so I dasn't lord this over anyone, but I do feel like, in a way, a lot of my artistic production ends up as lines of code and the art that goes behind it. So if I make something and it's code, it's always backed up by sort of like trying it in an artful context, trying it in front of an audience, trying it as part of a recording process or whatever. And so there's artfulness that ties into it. And I've often had trouble kind of describing my feelings about that because it either sounds like I'm being too, not promoting myself as an artist. I used to have this thing where I'm like, well, I'm making paintbrushes for Picasso, which is kind of a stupid way to say it because, but in a way, I feel like the things that I'm making from a code standpoint are really an artistic output. Now, you have developed a lot of different code-based results. The RTCBix project probably being the primary one. Would that be correct?
I'd say yes. I mean, I've done the 12-bar blues stuff and everything like that. A lot of the simulation thing that was all done with Lisp, and for a while I was on this mission of trying to embed every computer language known to man in Max MSP.
Yeah, watch out about that.
Yeah, I know. I mean, but I think the real. We had Miller Puckett and I had this kind of fun back and forth where I embedded what was it? He had embedded PD, and I re-embedded it so you could actually like call each environment like recursively. It was really horrible. it's funny because you did something there. I was going to jump all over you. I'm glad you put the small quotes around what you're saying, you're doing with your code.
Yeah, because you've jumped all over me about this in the past. So
I know. I'd take the quotes away. And, what I'd say was like, but, when you are actually developing the code, that's what it is. That's the artistic action right there, And I said, don't focus on this final object that you've done because that's the path to evil, But then you tempered it and you talked about how you then, the real kick for you in a certain way, beyond developing the code, which is, pretty amazing, is when you then use it in an artistic context,
right.
When you're in a recording session or when you're performing on stage or something like that, And that's I think a really good point, that, there are many ways that these sort of artistic objects that we create can function. I think what I bridle against is when people try to restrict that functionality and they say, well, all this code you've done, that's just an adjunct for this, the real activity.
Right.
And that's what you run into that in academia all the time. That's a whole high modernist nonsense that just drives me crazy, but anyhow.
Yeah, well, there is this sense in a lot, and it's a concern because a lot of people sort of reject academia because the academia has this tendency to say there's art and there's craft, and we give no benefits to craftiness. We give acknowledgement only to art, and especially as throughout the development of computer music, but also as computer music becomes more normalized, that seems to be a really ridiculous kind of bifurcation.
Right. I like, who are these people that make that distinction? Come on, give me a break.
Yeah, right. Good point. There are people who can't do craft. That's who it is.
Right. I know, that's true. The one thing I will kind of say in academia's defense, though, and it's been a long time in coming, but I do detect the climate is much different now, based on what I see, say, our students doing, our former students, out in the world and things like that, is that if you take academia as a place where you essentially have untrammeled freedom in a way you cannot find elsewhere, that's the best.
Right.
Because, once you say, well, let's get rid. It's funny. Some people faced with that freedom, they want to make those distinctions between art and craft because then they want to say, well, I need to legitimize my work. So therefore I'll construct this artificial intellectual edifice, that says this is what I'm really doing here. Jettison that, and what you're left with is a vast field of play where you can just do amazing stuff. And like I said, in my happier moments, I think that's what the world is becoming. Maybe that's not quite true. But
I don't know. I think it is. Now, I want to kind of dive into this a little further, especially as it relates to you and working with your students. I just got done rereading for probably the 20th time the book Art and Fear. And one of the things that they talk about in there is that how for a great majority of, it's mostly oriented around art school rather than music school, but I think it applies in this case. They talk about how oftentimes the last show that people do as students is the last show that they ever do in their lives. Because when they're in school, they're focused on doing these, on creating these works and putting them in front of people. And but when the pressure to have to do that is gone, most people tend not to follow up on it. Now, I would say that that's true in all kinds of artistic things, except one of the things I notice is it tends to not be true with your students. And Jeff Snyder is a perfect example.
Or Luc Dubois.
Or Luc Dubois is another great example.
Right.
What is it you think that propels or compels people to continue their work after they leave school? I mean, do you think that it's something at Columbia? Do you think it's something about the location in New York and kind of the community and the aspects of New York that make it kind of special? What do you think kind of drives that into happening?
I think, well, New York is a part of it, and the group of incredible students we get every year at Columbia is another part. But there's a missing ingredient, and because these students, a lot of people will go out and they'll go elsewhere. Mara Helmuth now in Cincinnati. Doug Gears when he was back in Minnesota, and they'll still continue to do their work. So the New York thing isn't a necessary ingredient. I think what it is that we let our students do what they want to do. Mm-hmm. And that's, believe it or not, that's kind of a big deal. A lot of programs I know. Oh man, Dan Truman. When I met him, I was teaching for a year at Cincinnati, and Dan was ready to just jettison music. Not to cast aspersions on Cincinnati, because it's a great place, especially with Mara there now.
Right.
They're doing fabulous work.
Yeah.
But he was actually majoring in music theory. That was his master's work, and he was just completely disillusioned by the whole enterprise, because I went to see Dan play in this. He had this band that he was playing with at the time, where he was first beginning to use his fiddle.
Right.
In a way like that, and just get out of the way and let him do what he wants to do. When he came out, sadly he went to Princeton instead of Columbia. Once you say, Dan, do what you like to do. Well, he talks about this. There's a web page, sort of dedication to Paul Lansky on the occasion of his retirement, where Dan tells a story about how Paul said, you should do more of that fiddle stuff. And Dan said, "Oh well." Or when listening to Jeff Snyder's interview you did last week, where I said, "Jeff, what happened to all these musical instruments?" I remember that conversation too.
Right. Yeah.
All of a sudden they go, "Wow, I can do that." There are a lot of cases where students come out of programs where they've been channeled into doing the proper music, and they don't afterwards. But if you realize these are people who want to do stuff that they want to do, of course they're going to continue to do it, because that's who they are. So,
and it seems like the world is actually a little more open to that as well. I mean, it wasn't all that long ago that a person like Jeff would have made a thing like the Manta and driven around to the 5 companies that were making audio materials, and they would have all rejected him, and then he would have gone off to work at an automotive factory somewhere,
Right.
But
aerospace.
Or aerospace, right. And in fact, the world has kind of changed to where sort of like a guy with his idiosyncratic way of doing things is embraced by the community in some useful way.
Yeah. And I think, it manifests in all kinds of ways. I think of, Michael Klingbeil in the SPEAR program, I mean, he came into my office and said, I got an idea to do a program. You described it, and I said, oh, well, go ahead, knock yourself out, kid. And, a year later, out comes this incredible sort of interface.
Right.
Sam Pluto, any of these people I can name, they you give them enough rope, and they'll do their thing.
Sure. Well, let's talk about your some of your work, because there's one. Yeah, watch out. There's actually one thing that you've shared with me that I find really interesting, which is a growing fascination with the idea of interactive books or book-like things. I shouldn't call them books because, first of all, they're implemented as code. Yay, code. But secondly, they are sort of like complete in their thoughtfulness, in that there's not a lot of sort of the standard framework of a computer program. You've developed things that sort of take over the environment and present themselves in a way that's very unique. The first one I saw was some years back. You created one. I don't even remember what you developed it in, but it would run on a Macintosh, I think, only, maybe. Does that sound right?
Yeah, most of them ran on Windows, but the Windows versions were kind of flaky. The first one I did was called My Music Book, was back 2001, I think.
Okay.
And that I used a language called JSON that Phil Burke wrote because it ran on both Windows. It was a Java-based language.
Okay.
Ran on Windows and Macintoshes.
Right.
And the second one I did entirely in Max MSP. That was My Book of Dreams. That may be the one that you're thinking.
That's the one I'm thinking of. That's the first one that I saw, I think.
Right. And again, I did it at the time. I'm not sure it still runs because I have not updated the RT CMix tilde object for Windows. But at the time, it ran on both Mac and Windows because Mac's MSP was running on both.
Right.
And that was a very easy way to make the interface. The latest one I did, it's not out yet. In fact, you're one of the beta testers.
Yeah, I know. Well, thank you, by the way.
It's a book of memories. As I get older, I discover how precious our memories are. So essentially, it's just like, it's probably, it's funny. I thought it was boring for a lot of other people, but people who've read it said, well, it really made me think about my own life. It's like memories of playing with my sister at Christmas time when we were younger and stuff like that. And I did that. It's funny because the platforms for creating an interactive book are now, in 2001, not much existed, but now this is developed primarily for iPads and Kindle Fires.
Right.
Two popular reading devices. It'll run on other platforms, but that's really, what the architecture is supposed to be.
Right.
And the fun part of the code was I had to port the code that I was using for the audio engine, this RT CMix language, to both Android and iOS. I had a lot of help with Damon Holtzborn. He's one of my grad students, just finished his degree. Yeah, the idea was to create this thing that tied together. Obviously I like to talk, Darwin. Here we are.
Dude, I do too. Why do you think I do a podcast?
Right, I know.
Because otherwise I'm sitting up in the mountains here kind of looking out the windows saying, why won't anyone talk to me, man?
Yeah, I know that feeling. In the wilds of New Jersey.
Yeah, that's right.
Anyhow, but it's funny because the idea of the books actually grew out of something even earlier. And it was a recognition of technology providing an opportunity for presenting music in a way that was, I hate to bash on this, but outside the concert context. Because to me that was just a default position. And I started questioning, is this the best way to do the kind of music that I want to do and communicate the kind of things I want to communicate? And I started creating these little applications that would run. The first one, we had Next machines back in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And that was all the rage in the computer music research community.
Right.
And the cool thing about Next machines is they had a Motorola 65K DSP chip separate from the processor.
Right.
And David Jaffe had written this program called the Music Kit, which allowed you to design algorithms that would run just on that processor. And to learn the Music Kit, I wrote this little ambient music application that I called Looching, and wrote it entirely in the Music Kit so that basically I could run it while I was doing other stuff on the main CPU, like working on code or something. I'd have this thing running in the background. And I put it out. This is before the web and, HTTP and browsers and everything. I put it up on an FTP site at Purdue University. And within 2 weeks, I was getting emails from people all over the world who downloaded and were enjoying this program. And I thought, whoa, this is pretty cool.
Yeah.
I didn't have to dub cassettes or anything. So I began to explore the idea that you can create these little algorithmic pieces that unfold on a processor and essentially establish almost a one-to-one communication with, say, an audience, if you want to call it that. Rather than having to put people in a hall and blast the sound, and like, oh, listen to me, I'm a composer god.
Right.
This was a way of creating these things, almost like, and this is the key that led to the books, almost like the relationship that an author has with you when you read a novel. It's like you establish this communication with this creative entity through the medium of the novel. And I found that to be, very compelling. It's a very direct and very engaging. God, I use that word too much. You know what I mean.
It fits. Right.
Yeah, it's a strong relationship. I thought, dang, I wonder if I could actually create that same intense one-on-one experience by tying everything together in a book. And I thought, well, I'm not a very good author, and I am good at making weird sounds. So what I'll do is make a book with a soundtrack.
Right.
And the key, and this is where the algorithmic stuff, the stuff that I'd learned by creating these little unfolding algorithmic processes, is that you need to be able to accommodate different reading speeds and different reading things. If you're going to tie the music into the text, you have to be able to have some kind of response. Otherwise, just play a CD in the background.
Right, right.
I wanted something that would be completely integrated between what you were reading and what you were hearing. And then I expanded it with the Book of Dreams to also some graphics. And then the current one has little videos that are embedded and things like that. And it became almost, again, this is that opportunity I talk about with technology, a way of creating a new type of artistic expression by bringing together these strands of technological capability, so that all of a sudden you've got something that's essentially different, I think,
Sure. Now, one of the things I would ask, so looking both at the Book of Dreams and the new thing, I'm first of all struck by how it's very much, you've developed sort of a platform to have a very personal voice, and I think that's cool, because when I read it while I'm listening to the Luching, and a little side note, you actually are a collaborator with me on practically every gig that I do. Because I have iLuch on my iPhone, and whenever I find myself kind of like twisted up on the modular, I'll just like kick off iLuch to kind of fill in a blank until I can.
Seriously?
Oh yeah,
I didn't know that.
I do that all the time. I mean, literally every gig.
Thousands of billions of dollars in royalties.
Well, you come get it, because if you can find it, I'm willing to let you have as much as you can find.
Oh wow, that makes me feel pretty good. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. But one of the things that I'm curious about is you've made this personal thing, and to a certain extent, it seems like a wonderful way to take these memories, make them concrete in a way that's going to allow people to enjoy and appreciate them in the future. However, unlike an actual book, you're putting this together with technologies that who knows how long they're going to last. I mean, with a book, unless all of a sudden somebody decides that we have to change the wavelength of light, it's a technology that's going to work until the pages crumble, right?
Yeah.
But that's not the case with computing devices, where we're in such a rush to get the new version of whatever that an awful lot of stuff gets left behind. Yeah. And I know just for myself, I've got the detritus of the last 30 years of creativity sitting on floppy disks and jazz drives, and some of it luckily made it to CDR, which I can still at least harvest from. But how do you imagine this work that you're doing being able to sort of live beyond the cratering of the current technology? And still being valid for the people who are going to want to experience this work.
I'm gonna pull a Richard Rorty thing here.
Uh-oh.
And just say I ignore that question.
Awesome, that's an option.
I mean, it's funny because I think it was Paul used to say this. Paul Lansky used to say, if you start writing for the ages or worrying about the future or something, it's the kiss of death for artistic work, And to a certain extent, I just kind of buy into that. If I'm fortunate enough that I can do something that reaches a few other people now, I'm a happy guy. I'm kind of, the other thing Paul said is you always write for yourself. And basically, again, academia gives me that freedom. Right. I can sit at home and I can put together these things. And a lot of times I sit there and go, that was pretty good, Brad. The depressing part is then I go, well, you're the only person who's really going to listen to this. Right. That's the flip side of it. But I think, if you try to, first of all, you will overlook the possibilities that are presented by contemporary technology. If you say, well, I'm only going to do things that will be able to somehow migrate to the future. And secondly, that's a little presumptuous too.
Well, it is, but I mean,
I know what you mean.
I'm not necessarily saying that someday someone's going to treat you like, George Washington.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things, especially when it comes to very personal stories and personal expressions, there's this sense that your family will find it valuable,
right,
in the future, and so I always every time I do one of these podcasts, I come out of it with a little bit of personal growth. And you've just given me the opportunity to have that experience by saying, shut the fuck up and do something, right? I mean, that really is kind of the crux of what you're saying, which is if you spend all your time worrying, you never get anything done.
Yeah, exactly right. I think also, I mean, there's a certain sense that, there is a growing body of stuff that at some point people are going to want to be able to resurrect. And that's, maybe I'm a techno-utopian here, but I do believe in the future virtue of simulation. And, it's funny, you see this happening now. Do you know what I discovered, it was about a year ago? When I was a kid, I was addicted to this game called Tempest.
Right.
It ran on Atari machines, right?
Yeah.
There's a website you can go to, and now it runs in your browser.
Yeah. Well, that's true. And for some things, that seems to be, it has, I think a lot of it has to do with how engaged people with, like, the Leathermen strapped to their belt find it. Right?
Yeah.
So Tempest will draw them in. Unfortunately, my copy of Laurie Anderson's Puppet Hotel, which runs on some ancient version of Director, doesn't seem to have engaged the geeks in the same way, and that sits forlorn on my thing, begging me to find a way to make it run.
Give it time.
Give it time. Yeah, eventually.
Pretty soon we'll all have quantum computers in the cloud that'll run anything and everything.
That's true. And maybe if I can somehow compel someone to believe that Tempest ran under Adobe Director, or Macromedia Director, that would really come to my aid.
Or you just might find at some point that it just simply runs. Simulation of something and go, hey, wow, this stuff now works.
Actually, there are people that are doing simulations of, like, Mac OS 8. And so conceivably, I could rumble back through that thread of goodies and work it out that way.
Yeah. It's funny. The coding of the books, and especially the recent books, I saw something. Poor David Byrne. He'd created this really wonderful thing. I think it was using. Oh gosh, I can't remember what program he was using. It was one of those early kind of presentation, sort of Mac script-like programs.
Right.
And it was just he had just a couple of videos that he'd made of the screen. It was just hysterical. Problem is that he was relying on the maximum CPU speed. So he was just basically the code was just like do everything you can as fast as you can.
Yeah. And now it's just like I blink.
yeah. It's just like it's over. So it's funny because dealing with different types of things like tablets versus desktops versus laptops versus iPhones, they all have radically different computing capabilities, and you actually embed in the code timing information, stuff like that. So theoretically, if there's a simulation, it should run okay. Right. But that's a little techno-geeky. I think, again, the basic point is you do what you think you can do best at the moment.
Right.
And, if you want to get all kind of writing for the future, writing for the ages about it, that's probably the best stance to adopt. When Bach was, using equal temperament, said, well, this is really cool, and I'm going to write the best stuff I can for it.
Right.
And all of a sudden, maybe we ought to check out this equal temperament stuff. Yeah, here we are comparing ourselves to Bach, Darwin. I don't think so.
Yeah.
But the deeper thing is just, here's this stuff. What are you going to do with it?
Yeah, that's great advice. And as always, you provide a thoughtful alternative to me and my overly emotional wrap-up of my life. So there you go.
Oh, come on. I can get way more emotional than you. Read the book.
Well, okay. Now I'm scared to. It's going to just maybe it's a book of chidings. Maybe that's the next one you need to do.
I don't think
so. The book of chidings.
Yes, the book of chidings. Yeah, right. Throw some sticks and then read what chide you get today.
Well, I know that you've got a schedule to meet, and I and we're running on an hour here already. It's amazing how this time flies.
Oh yeah.
There's about 10,000 other things I wanted to talk to you about, so maybe we'll pick it up on a follow-up podcast at some point in the near future. But
Love
I want to
to.
thank you so much for spending the time and kind of like driving all over the landscape here with me. It's a lot of fun.
Oh man, yeah. I mean, this is like I said. I feel like I've got a good job today.
Yeah, I'm telling you, me too. Well, thanks a lot,
Well,
and I will talk to you again soon.
okay,
All
take
right,
care.
bye.
Bye bye.
I'm on vacation right now, so I'm not going to be very responsive on email. But I just want to thank everyone for listening in and supporting the podcast. As always, if you have any questions or comments, reach out to me, ddg at cycling74.com. I'm always happy to hear from listeners. If you have any suggestions, or most particularly, if you'd like to be interviewed, reach out. I got some open spots coming up, so I'd love to get some interesting people with some new perspectives on the whole art, music, and technology thing. Thanks a lot, and have a great week.